So again, thanks for inviting us. I know our focus tonight is the reporting that was done on the Me Too movement, and there's a lot going on right now in news. I'm sure you're aware of. So, but focusing on Me Too, it's a really challenging and often, very difficult topic because, it's often he said, she said, and I think Joyce brings this up, we'll bring this up too. And as outlets, we have to vet all of the claims multiple times before we go to publication, and we often have to go back to our sources multiple times, or confer with people that know the sources, or go back to people who we thought might have known what was going on at the time. And we search records. I call it sort of triangulating the information. And the corroboration sometimes leads us to multiple people, but we often have to go back to our victims multiple times. So, in essence, we are treating some of these stories like we treat any other story we would do, but there's this little added twist. There's this added responsibility that as journalists we feel that we have to the ethics of the story, and how do we report some of these claims when we can't get people on the record? How do we get them on the record? How do we source things? How do we build those sources? How do we continue our credibility and our ethics? Because as journalists, really, that's our commodity, is our credibility. And in the job of journalism, how do we communicate among a reporter, an editor, a managing editor, the head of your outlet? How does all that communication happen? And as I've said up here a couple of times, you may have heard me, how do you manage the harmony with your personal life and your professional life when you find yourself on a story that's got you sometimes at the center of the story, or it's got you working 14-hour days for maybe a week, 2 weeks at a time? And what about those subjects that may be a little too close to comfort for you, or those subjects that you find you've never really explored on your own, and perhaps maybe subjects you're not sure how you feel about them? Maybe they aren't subjects that you particularly would typically report on if you had a choice. So those are some of the things we're going to cover, and as you can hear, those aren't all specific to the Me Too reporting. They're really about reporting in general. So I think this is a really good moment for us to be able to explore all of these areas of journalism. And again, we want to keep this interactive. This is for you. We've got a couple hours here. I know you guys have a lot of questions, and I really want to keep it really for you. So my goal here is to get Joyce and Melanie talking about their experience in reporting this out. I'm going to try and keep us focused on those little areas that I talked about, but I really want feedback from you, and I know all of us, the three of us, appreciate the feedback and the questions coming from you, because again, we're here for you. So here at this table, you have a reporter, you have an editor, and you have a managing editor. So you have really this wonderful ecosystem of reporting in a newsroom. We're missing a few parts, but this is generally part of a good part of the ecosystem. And first, and so we got a little introduction to Joyce. Why don't you just go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself, so they don't have to hear me blabbering on the whole time.
So why don't I talk a little bit about how what my involvement is on a story like this. And to be clear, former executive editor of the Bee, I left in February. So I was there for a good bit of this story. It was a difficult, intense, and very fun story to work on. It is, I think, kind of at the core of what we do as journalists, exposing powerful people doing bad things. And it is the Melanies of the world. In the Bee's case, it was primarily initially Taryn Luna and Alexei Kosov who do the very laborious, tenacious work that has to be done to land a story like this. It's just a lot of street reporting, developing sourcing, going back and back and back and back. And then where I get involved, and Linnea, I presume you as well, is after a lot of that work has been done. It's not like you're removed from it. You're talking constantly to editors during that time. I was anyway. And I would know where we were, and we'd be talking about whether we had enough to go with the story or not. And then when we got the story, what we thought we could get at that point, it's like, is everything answered? Is the support actually there? Do we have to go back one more time or 2 more times and do all of that? So it is a very different level, I think, than the work that, you know, others are doing. And I think that that for all of you, hearing about how somebody actually goes out and develops that trust from somebody that's an important part of this, much more so than most stories, I think. And then, you know, the vetting along the way is how we actually land it and publish it. So,
Yeah. Is this on?
Hello. Hi, I'm Melanie, and I've been with the Times for 7 years and here in Sacramento for 5. And to actually take this a little bit further back than what we think the beginning of the story was, I started hearing from my sources pretty soon after I got to Sacramento, just some whispers about, like, there are some gross things going on at the Capitol, and particularly the work environment for women was not great. In fact, I very clearly remember going into my bureau chief's office in 2016 and saying, I think I'd like to do a story about how the culture for women in Sacramento sucks, which is, you know, as eloquent as one can be. But and he said, yeah, I think, you know, you can go ahead and pursue this if you want to be looking into it. But it was nothing but brick walls when it came to reporting. So I started talking to lobbyists, people, staffers that worked in the building, all off the record, just to say, like, hey, you know, I've just been hearing the you know, when it comes to either harassment or kind of lecherous legislators or staffers or other lobbyists, like that this is something you have to contend with pretty frequently. Would you feel comfortable talking about it? And we would have off-the-record conversations, and then I'd say, would you be interested in kind of pushing this further? And they'd say, absolutely not. Like, that's not going to happen. And then the other route that I was looking into was records, which a lot of times if you're doing reporting and if you're not getting sort of the sources on the ground talking, you try and find some paper. And so I started asking people who worked in the building, hey, if I was going to try and find some records, you know, for some folks, you know, I put in those requests, would those kind of requests get approved? And they said, absolutely not. Because the legislature, which we have now written extensively about, exempts itself from a lot of public disclosure laws. So I knew that this was a problem and kind of figured that I would keep chipping away at it, but I honestly didn't really know where to go with it. And then fast forward to October of 2017, and I'm sitting in the vet's office waiting for my puppy to get a checkup, and a lobbyist friend source of mine texts me and says, hey, someone I know just got kind of manhandled by a fellow lobbyist, and this was just right after the Harvey Weinstein story broke, and they were just seething over the fact that even when everyone was hyper aware about sexual harassment, there was still at an event with lobbyists there, like unwanted physical contact that happened. It was like people weren't translating that this macro conversation that people were having about Harvey Weinstein actually applied here. And I texted back and I said, yeah, I know, I've tried to do a story about that, it's really hard. And she texted, she goes, I think that people are gonna be more willing to talk. And within 3 days, they had put together a letter that more than 140 women signed that basically cried out about a pervasive atmosphere of harassment in the Capitol. And that set off about 4 months of me covering nothing but sexual harassment. And there's lots of different facets to the story. There was, you know, letting the women talk about their own experiences, sort of in their voices, and that was kind of the first stage. We were talking less about individuals and more about kind of the macro issue about what is the culture, what is the work environment, what are the sort of elements that maybe encourage this kind of behavior or at least make it easier for people to get away with. Then we started getting to the point where individual legislators were being called out, and that was, you know, that was really kind of pure investigative work, and that required a lot of work with my editors, with our lawyer, you know, we can get into that. And then there was sort of the public right to know question, which is another big element and one that we continue to press on, which is, you know, I had heard rumblings of this years before, and when I asked for records, I was denied, and that's because of the laws that the legislature has passed for itself. And we don't think that that's right. And so trying to push ahead and sort of on the broader issue of, you know, not just now when this issue is hot and they're feeling under scrutiny, but are there going to be significant lasting changes to how the legislature discloses bad behavior that's happening in its own ranks?
So you guys have an overview of where we've been with the reporting. I want to start with probably the critical part of this story, and it's about building sources. And I think you both touched on that. And Melanie, I'm glad you brought up the fact that you were hearing about this years ago, because that's when you start building your sources, and you never know when you're going to find a source really important. The fact that Melanie says she got a text when she was sitting in the vet's office, right? This is where the payoff comes in. That's the payoff of the work you do with your sources. So I know that you didn't have a lot of sources immediately, and I know that you had to go and go back to sources maybe you had cultivated a little bit. Tell us a little bit about, and sort of stepping away from the Me Too moment for just a moment, but as a reporter, when you come into a new area, a new region, a new beat, what are the things that you do to build those sources?
I try to have as many off the record or background conversations when I'm not on deadline as possible. I think that one of the things that in building those relationships, it's not just about I need a quote from you to slot into this story that I'm working on that I need to file in 30 minutes. It is having conversations that don't really have a specific purpose other than just kind of a getting to know you, them getting to know me finding out what kind of work they're doing, trading gossip. I mean, trading gossip is a lot of a job. I joke with people that I gossip for a living. But the truth is that that's all part of the relationship building. And they get a sense then from me, like what interests me, what I think is then kind of a story. And then they might say like, hey, I'm not working on this, but you might want to check out this thing over here. And I think a lot of it is also just the kind of interpersonal connection that I think then helped me quite a bit in doing this reporting that quite frankly was really sensitive, because you're asking people to talk to you about what was maybe the worst day of their life or incident or work experience that was like remarkably unpleasant, and you're not going to want to tell that to somebody that's a complete stranger. And quite frankly, having those relationships sort of before all of this crashed helps quite a bit. And then that also meant that I had a reputation for the people who I didn't know, but maybe had friends who did know me. They could vouch for me and say, I've talked to her. She's a normal human being. Like, she'll talk to you about, Beyonce. and it's not all business all the time. And I think that kind of humanizing aspect in terms of getting to know your sources means that when these big stressful stories do come, you're starting from a foundation that's a lot stronger than just kind of calling over the transom and saying, tell me all your deepest, darkest secrets right now. I have to file a story in 30 minutes.
That's a good point. And Joyce, as an editor who you've got your reporters on deadline, or we've and in my situation too, I know I've got requirements for the reporters day to day. A reporter comes to you and says, there's a particular part of this beat that I want to build, and I want to take some time out of my day to go and build these sources. How does the reporter come to you? What is the best thing for a reporter, especially a new reporter, to say to an editor who really wants to build their sources, but they know they've got requirements coming from you? How do they approach you with that?
So I've been in a lot of different editing jobs over the years and was a reporter myself starting out, so I've got kind of this a different perspective from different stages. You can do a certain amount of sourcing by doing stories, because when you're brand new to a beat, you're getting out to meet people and you're talking to them, you will find stories as you're talking to them, and so you are being very efficient, shall we say, at both finding stories and also meeting people. But I think anybody, even if you're working a live story, can carve out time to be talking to somebody. That's just kind of a part of the routine, and it's just something you need to make kind of like your daily habit. You're doing your live calls, or you're out talking to people in person for interviews, and then you're stopping by at the office next door, especially if you're in a public workplace. It's so much easier than if you're out in a business or somewhere where they are limiting who you talk to. I've always personally experienced and then advised people, don't think you're just supposed to talk to the bosses or the elected officials. Your best stories might come from the secretaries or the brand new person in the office who wants attention and overheard something. Some people do just want attention, And, you know, you were saying sometimes you feel like you're just trading in gossip. Some people like to gossip, and some, you need to be smart enough to know whether they know what they're talking about, or whether they just like to gossip, especially, I would imagine, in the Capitol, because it is a giant high school, is how some people describe it to me, anyway. Back in the early 2000s, the Bee did some reporting on sexual harassment settlements that had happened. It was very difficult to get the information, but the reporter working on it at the time got it by talking to low-level people, especially women, who either had been suffering through it or witnessing it, and they were really angry about it. You know, he didn't get it by, he did the calls you're supposed to do to the Rules Committee, which is their version of HR, and to the electeds and people like that. He didn't get the story that way. He got it by just kind of talking to a lot of different people and putting himself out there. It is never a bad thing to talk to as many people as you can. It's the only way for a story like this.
I like that you mentioned even when you're working on something, there's always some time to carve out.
Yeah.
And I over the years, I've realized that a good reporter, when they go out on a story, they will come back with at least 3 story ideas. And usually we have to rein them in because we don't have enough time for all of those stories, but the fact that they're out there and talking to people gets their ideas going. And it also, again, it helps build their sources. And I think going along with building the sources, and I think you mentioned it, Melanie, is this idea of credibility, right? You're building a relationship with somebody, you're building trust, and oftentimes when you do go to the person who's unhappy, who's new, who is looking for attention, you have to go realizing that they are seeking something from you, and yet our credibility as journalists is really all the commodity that we have, right? My word is my word, you're going to have my word. If we are on background, you're not going to see it in print. You're not going to see it, you know, on the air. You're not going to hear it on the air. You're not going to see. So, is there any moment, maybe when you were first starting out, where this idea of credibility or ethics, anything you can think of that was a moment, maybe early in your career, where you thought, wow, here's a crossroads I'm at. Maybe it's a great story. Maybe it's a great source. Is there anything you can?
Yeah, well, I mean, so when I was an intern, in between my years at journalism school, I worked at Politico, and the first assignment that I got was to evaluate members' websites and basically call out like who had the worst websites. It was a weird assignment, but I was an intern and I was very eager and I was going to take it super seriously, and so I looked at all 535 websites of members of Congress.
And I believe you.
Yeah, no.
And was it calling them out on the information that they had on there,
it was just
or
like
presentation
design.
Oh.
It was a little bit of a mean-spirited idea, but again, I was an intern and I was like all into it. And so then I identified the ones I thought looked the worst, and I called their offices and I just said, hey, I'd like to talk to you about your website. And I turned the story and Medder goes, did you tell them that the websites are bad? And I said, no. And I just told them like I wanted to talk about their website. And that was a bad thing to do because they were surprised by what was in the story. And for me, that was the lesson, and it was here's the mistake I made, which is your sources shouldn't be surprised by what's in your story. They may not like what's in your story, but you need to have the kind of confidence in yourself and the presence of mind while you're like, before it's gonna roll out, to say like, all right, like, hey, I'm calling you because your website's pretty bad. Do you wanna explain why it's bad? Are you guys gonna make it any better? This is, because if not, your credibility is like, this was a bait and switch. And that was I'm glad I learned that when I was an intern. And now I can have the conversation with sources ahead of time. It's not showing them the story pre-publication. That's ethically not a good thing. But to tell them, like, your perspective is going to be in this story because we've talked about it, but there's also going to be other perspectives. And you may not be super thrilled with sort of how this comes out, but you are going to, I want you to know that your perspective was heard, it was considered, and you're not going to be surprised by the tone of the story when it comes out. And I think that goes a long way in establishing your credibility. And I think to that end, to sort of bring it back to the Me Too conversation, when we were doing these investigations into individuals, we were very detailed and specific when we went to the lawmakers about what kind of allegations were against them. And first of all, like, you had to do that legally. I mean, we were, you know, these were investigations that had our lawyers involved. We were really making sure that we were not going to be hit with the libel lawsuit, which is very hard to do for public officials, but we were not going to risk that. But also, like, it's their right to be able to, and they have to be able to respond to every element, and they should not be surprised by what's in that story. When the story ran, they could say, you know, those women aren't telling the truth. They can say, you know, I never did any of this stuff, but nobody ever said after that story that Melanie, the reporter, misrepresented what she was reporting, and that was really important to me. So I think that is sort of, having learned as an intern about people's bad websites, that people shouldn't be surprised. I think that absolutely guided my reporting during this.
Yeah, that's a great point. Joyce, anything as an editor, maybe? And I think Melanie brought up something that maybe we can touch on, if not now, later, but this idea of showing your story. A lot of times people say, well, I'll talk to you, but I want to see the story before it prints. Anything like that, or any of the other? Yeah, no. I know, that's always the one that, why are you even asking me this, is the, yeah.
No, but I was thinking as you were talking about your experience in this coverage, we said enough coverage, you know, one of the key elements is, you know, you're talking, some of the coverage involves what happened to people who don't want it to be public, what happened to them, right? And it is so personal and so traumatic an experience for some people that it is something that we were very sensitive about. So if you look at the coverage that Taryn Luna did for the Sacramento Bee about Senator Tony Mendoza, former senator, I should say, because her coverage caused him to leave the Senate finally. The woman who was the initial victim, if you will, I hate that term, but I'm going to use it right now, just briefly. We had heard about what happened to her, and we heard about it from other people around her, and she never actually talked to the Bee during that entire series of investigative stories that we did. We had to vet everything we were being told and confirm it and do the best reporting we could do without ever having her confirm to us that it happened. There were, fortunately, a lot of ways that we could do that, so we knew we had a very solid story, but part of our discussion throughout was, okay, she's a young woman starting out her career, you know, she doesn't want to talk about this publicly, and what she went through was just ridiculous, you know, for somebody at the beginning of their career with somebody like that as a boss. It needed to be called out. And so then you're weighing this notion of somebody's right to privacy against public good. And as it turned out, at the end of everything, you know, there were 6 women that have become public, that you know, we found 3 of them. Then the Senate did its own investigation and came out and said that there were at least 6. So there's a reason to do stories like this. It really does matter that somebody like that not be in office anymore, but you have to be very careful as you walk through it about somebody's right to privacy and making sure that you're being fair and you're not actually making the whole thing just much, much worse for an individual.
I think you're beginning to get into this next topic I want to cover, which is what happens when we do get a story like this and it becomes something that consumes you a little bit, but it also becomes something that you want to get to the bottom of it, and you're going from source to a document to somebody calling you another tip, and we're really just in this thing and trying to you're not quite a pinball, but you are definitely going from one place to another, trying to keep that thread. And so, Joyce, I want you to sort of talk us through the communication that needs to happen in any story, this story in particular, but any story, the communication that happens between a reporter on the ground who is fielding tips left and right, probably 24/7, I'm imagining, and the reporter who is at the Capitol, pounding the pavement, wanting to get this particular story out, wanting to get that particular angle out. As the editor, how do you bring all that together, and how do you help them focus where to go next, and what becomes the important story to tell today, and then the day after, and then a week from now?
So you have to think about how this story started. You got your text. For much of the world, it started when the women involved, I think it was 147, they took out a full-page ad in the LA Times and basically said, we said enough, and encouraged, they had a website, they encouraged people to share experiences, and they just called out the culture and the pervasive sexual harassment and even assault. Some of the initial allegations and then the reality that the reporting showed afterwards they're criminal assault. It's not sexual harassment. It is far worse than that. So there were both things going on. And nobody named names. So you had powerful women attached to the Capitol community saying that somebody's, masturbating in front of me, somebody's sexually assaulting me, all of this sexual harassment is going on, and it involves elected officials, and nobody's saying who it is. And so I remember on, I think it was an Insight program, but listening to Capitol Public Radio, where the whole conversation was about, well, how can they do that? Is it the right thing to do? So I'm sure the LA Times did what we did and everybody else did, which was you just start with every single person who signed the letter, and you're out talking to every source you have, and maybe even people that are not your sources, trying to figure out, okay, who did what. And
Can I back you up there? Because I know what we all did. Specifically, when you say we start with all those names on the list.
Right. Oh, what do you do?
Tell exactly what you guys did. I didn't know you did.
Sure,
as
sure.
well.
Yeah, in terms of we had reporters on the phone, we had reporters going out and meeting with people. It isn't all in-person conversations, because some people are doing their job and they don't have time to, go have coffee with you. But where you can get a face-to-face, I think that's always much more valuable. But we had several reporters just kind of on the phones all day long, calling people, trying to find out specifics. And what you get are pieces. This person knows this little thing about this person over here, or this attorney will say, well, yeah, I know who did that, but she's not ready to go public about it, and I'm not going to help you with that. But you get maybe pieces that, well, this person was a lobbyist, and they used to work for this office, or, and so it becomes this puzzle in terms of tracking down information. It's like, okay, who was in this office at that time? That kind of information is public information. Who left to go work for a lobbying firm? And you just kind of start narrowing down potentials, and then talking either directly to somebody, or if they won't talk to you, talking to people who worked with them or friends, and you just start finding things out. It is a lot of little pieces of information, and then sometimes there are people who know a lot who will tell you a lot. But this story, more than most, was putting together a lot of little pieces.
And just to follow up on that, on the main investigative pieces that I did, I think only 2 out of it's probably around 10 to a dozen women who I talked to combined for the stories actually signed that letter. That letter was signed by women who were in a position to put their names publicly. In fact, I joked to one of my colleagues that he was helping me make calls down the list, and he comes over to my desk and he goes, I just realized something. All of these women who signed the letter, they own their own firms. And I'm like, mm-hmm. Like, what? And what does that tell you? And he's like, they only feel empowered to speak out because they can't get fired. And I'm like, mm-hmm. Like, it was like all of a sudden, like everything was clicking into motion. So that letter, although it was a roadmap, it was actually not. It did not unlock a lot of the key pieces, because they were women who were like, oh yeah, well there's this thing, but it was this lawmaker from like 10 years ago. And I'm like, but if we were trying to focus on like the people who were in power now, they aren't going after the women who own their own lobbying firms because they know that they would get called out in a second. They're going after lower level staffers and women who are much less empowered to speak out. And I want to be clear, we're talking women because it's been primarily women who have come out with some of these allegations. There is, of course, one female lawmaker who is under investigation as well. So that victims, it's not specific to women. But it was, to your point, Joyce, about how it's, it's putting together pieces of a puzzle. It was also like all of us were starting from the same document, but that document actually wasn't the thing that sort of clicked everything into place. It was so many more phone calls and a lot of kind of over the transom stuff that actually sort of made those investigations fall into place.
So just for fun, let's pretend you're reporter, you're Melanie, and I'm the managing editor. You can't get a hold of your editor, but and you get this text. How does that work as a reporter? How does that work? What do you say? What do you say to your editor, so that your editor doesn't say, "What? What are you talking about? What did you say?"
I remember this because it was the same weekend that we were chasing Kevin DeLeon getting into the Senate race.
Yes.
So I was like, I remember calling my boss and saying, "Hey, I know we're all focused on this shiny object, but I think I'm gonna have to follow it up with this story." But I really downplayed it. I'm like, it's a daily, we'll write the letter, we'll get a couple of interviews. They're not naming any names, and I remember having to pitch really hard, it's okay that they're not naming names. And it wasn't that he was skeptical, but I just wanted to make it clear, this first story is not going to be the pointing fingers at people, which is why I said so it can be a daily, because if they started naming names, that was when we were going to have to get some investigative juice going. But yeah, so I remember just saying to him, "Hey, remember that conversation we had a year ago about the culture of the Capitol?" I was like, I think that this might be a moment where we can revisit. And I said, I think that this is going to be and quite frankly, this was not hard to pitch because everyone was talking about Harvey Weinstein, and there were so many other stories that were coming out. Our own paper was going really hard on the entertainment industry since that's our hometown industry. So just, it's always natural for whatever your beat is of what's the story that everybody's talking about and what's the angle in your beat. So here's a sexual harassment angle for state politics. But I remember I remember really downplaying expectations because I wanted to make it clear that this was, and I quite honestly, I had no idea that this was then going to consume my life to the extent that it did, which now I look back and think was incredibly naive, but I thought okay, they're ready to start the conversation, but I didn't think folks would be ready to start naming names. And in fact, people didn't start naming names for several weeks. There was several weeks where people really held the line. And so, yeah, I remember just pitching it, being it's no big deal. We can go back to the U.S. Senate race, but I just need to do this one story. And then, he never heard from me again.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm wondering, you knew about this before, sexual harassment, you said a cesspool, right? And why didn't you pursue this years before, or do you have to wait, or there's a cultural shift like the Harvey Weinstein, where then you can go for it, or you can't get anywhere until something big like this happens and there's a cultural shift?
Go ahead.
So we have done reporting over the years. Aurelia Rojas was the reporter I was talking about before, and that was in the early 2000s. And it is extraordinarily difficult to get that kind of story proven, basically, enough that you can put it into print. But we were able to do it at that time. We have gotten settlements over time. The difference now, I think, is that because of this giant shift in, from my perspective, it's in what people will believe in some ways. You see women, primarily, some men, but primarily women who are little by little willing to put their name to something publicly. And that's really unusual compared to before. And the truth of the matter is, I think if it were 10 years earlier and somebody did put their name to it, absent something to prove it, in that kind of he said, she said culture, you just had a hard time writing about it. I was doing some reading earlier today, and there was a lot of conversation after the Harvey Weinstein stuff came out about, okay, this was an open secret for really a long time. And why didn't anything ever get done? And both the New York Times and the New Yorker were working on it at least a decade earlier, and they couldn't get the women to go on the record, is what they say now, and so they dropped it. They were doing profiles and things like that, and they just didn't include that as part of it. And so you think about that, in this environment, there are women who have not gone on the record, and we've still been able to nail it and do something about it. And part of it, I think, journalists are using as a technique now, and I don't think that this was used long ago, is there's a lot of reporting going back to people who knew somebody at that time where they confided in them. So maybe they don't want to talk now about something that happened 10 years ago, but their office mate witnessed it, or their boyfriend at that time knew it, or their spouse, and you can get those kinds of things to help corroborate what happened. I've seen that in a lot of stories, and we've used that technique ourselves. And then there are things, you think about, this would have been a little bit harder in the 90s, but in today's era, you can get emails that people exchanged at the time, so you can get a document in writing. There are just different kinds of documents that you can get that you couldn't get before. What did you experience with that?
Well, I agree, and I think, you can't force people to tell the story if they're not ready to. And that was actually really important for me in terms of building these relationships, is that for every person, I told them, like, I'm not going to pressure you to do more than you are able and willing to do. But I also know that you might get more courage, so we're going to keep talking. But I took a really light touch. I mean, it was persistent, and it was a lot of checking in with people. But there were people who did not want to be on the record, and I would say, that's fine. And we would talk, and then I would keep, sort of triangulating and trying to get information around. But it was really important for me that I didn't feel like I was browbeating anyone to go on the record if they weren't ready, because the truth is like, I can move on to the next story, but their name's going to show up in that Google search for the rest of time, and the stakes are a lot higher for them. And I think that was something that I was really, I actually think Google in some ways that's been a really big factor in this, is there are a lot of people who were just like, I just don't want when my next employer search for me to find, that I'm in the story, even if, I was, the perfect victim, which again, I hate that word too, but just because it's for shorthand. Even if I did all the right things, it's still my name under a headline about sexual harassment. That sucks. And so I think, I haven't been in Sacramento that long, but the fact that I picked it up as early as I did probably goes to show what the culture was like. But before last fall, when I talked to people about, like, would you feel comfortable talking about this? It was just like, no, I can't do it. And I do think that there is clearly a public interest in this, which is why you can't drop the story entirely, but I'm not going to drag someone into on the record. And I think that, quite frankly, that approach helped refer people to me. People would say, like, she's, she'll listen to you and she'll keep your confidences, and if she won't push you to go further than you're ready to go. And I think that helped me a lot.
And as an editor, our primary goal is to make sure that we vet our sources, we vet our claims, and when we go to print or on the air, we are able to back that up. Whatever we do, I'm always telling the reporters, answer this for me, because I'm anticipating that first phone call I'm going to get. That first phone call I'm going to get is going to tell me whether or not I covered all my bases with the reporters. And over time, the way we're able to put things to publication has changed a little bit. I would say just maybe 4 years ago or so, even less than that, we would probably not have gone with a story where we could not get somebody on the record who made the claim. Now we are able to do this sort of triangulation. We can go with a story where we have multiple ways to corroborate what has happened. And that's been a little bit of a change. It's been a little bit of a shift. It's not something we prefer to do, and we still stay away from it. But I think we've realized that some of these stories, we do think they're really important to tell, and otherwise, we just can't tell them.
Well, but I wanted to just jump in on that, because I think that that's also been a really important part of this, and it's really hard, and it was interesting because there was it was like the floodgates broke open after Weinstein, and in every industry, it was like all of a sudden saw tons of stories. And I think the urgency that folks wanted about getting stories out there, you know, we wrestle a lot with like what is our standard, or like what do we need, and I do think that there are reasons why people can't go on the record, and if they'll talk to you on background, and if you can get other ways to corroborate it, that's how you're going to have to go about it. But I also think that it's really important to try and push as hard as you can to have people on the record. The second event story that I did about Raul Bocanegra, who was the first lawmaker who was named, I ended up having 6 women in that story, and up until about a week before publication, none of them were on the record. And I talked to my editors, and we thought, okay, well, maybe we will feel okay if they're all anonymous. And then the Roy Moore story came out from the Washington Post, which I thought was probably as flawless a piece of journalism on this topic as there's been. And I remember reading that story and thinking, my story's not ready yet. And in fact, I texted that story, a link to that story, to 4 of the women, 4 out of the 6 women who had all worked together. So they were all talking to each other, and had I won't jump if you won't jump mentality about it. And I said, I'm not pressuring you, but I want you to read this story, and I want you to think about how strong this story is, and how him saying that didn't happen is not credible because of how well the story is done, and how basically like every I is dotted, every T is crossed.
Give us a little synopsis of that for those that may not have
This is the man who was running for Senate in Alabama, a Republican, and a couple of weeks before election, the Washington Post did a story that I think had 3 women, maybe 4, who said that back in the 70s, Roy Moore had pursued romantic or sexual relationships with them when they were underage, including one woman who said that there was actual sort of sexual contact. I don't think they actually had sex, but there was some sort of inappropriate sort of physical touching when she was underage. And it established a pattern of him, he was in his 30s, going after these underage women. And it was an incredibly vitriolic campaign. Those women got dragged through the mud. It just goes to show how scary it is for women to come out and speak. But that story was bulletproof. Roy Moore lost the campaign because of it, and a Republican lost in Alabama because of his allegations. It was close, but he still lost. And the reason I sent it to those women that were on the fence is I said, I know that you want this story to be as strong as possible because your experiences with the now assemblyman were traumatic for you. And I said, don't give him the out of being able to say, these anonymous allegations aren't credible. Think about that. And that's all I said. And that was, again, light touch, but I just gave them an example of like, look how strong this can be. And I think that that's what pushed them over the edge. And I ended up having, of the 6 women, 4 of them were named. 4 of them were named fully. One of them was first name only, and then one of them was anonymous. So I want to make clear, like, anonymous sources, you have to use them sometimes, and they're important. And like Taryn's story about Tony Mendoza, like, you needed that anonymity. And that sort of was the crack in the dam that like let everything out. But I think in some other cases, not so much here in the Capitol, but elsewhere, I think people were so quick to offer anonymity that because there was just this like frenzy of the reporting. And I think we as reporters have to be very careful about like how strong can we make this story? Does it slow us down a little bit? But what's the end result? And I think that the end result is like the more you can have on the record, the better.
Did it make a difference that you were a woman?
Yeah, absolutely.
Does it make a difference that there are more women reporting and more women in editing positions than there were in the 70s when I was covering the Capitol, and I remember hearing these same stories, and some of us even experienced some of the inappropriate or witnessed it or heard about it, but the stories were not told.
So I don't know if everybody heard that. Sigrid asked if it makes a difference that more women are reporting, and there are more women as editors today than there were when she was covering the Capitol. Probably. And I say that because I know I mean, I've just been in so many discussions myself with a variety of people, including men I respect a great deal, and they just view what they say is different from what a woman says. You know, I don't know if it's the Mars-Venus thing or far more likely, I think it's because most women have experienced some form of this at one time or another in their career, and so they're more apt to believe it.
So
I-
men don't believe it?
I don't think all men do. I just, you know, I don't want to get into a gender wars thing here. I'm just saying, in my experience talking with people, I have come across that difference in maybe readiness to believe it.
Plus the problems in the media. I mean, we had a women's caucus at the Bee at the time. It was through the newspaper deal, the Bee and the Sacramento Union. And there were problems within the industry itself,
Mhm.
largely a result of, you know, there not being any women in these positions. There was very little diversity. And they weren't having the conversations that they needed to have.
And as we found out this year, there continue to be those kinds of problems, right?
Exactly.
You know, I mean, this is
Exactly.
not something that is limited to Hollywood and politics. It is across many different industries, and certainly media has had its own very high profile. In fact, it mostly started with media, right, at Fox News, long before Harvey Weinstein, so.
Yeah. I would say also what I think Melanie brought up is that her sources became empowered to speak out, and they recognized what she had brought to them was a way that they could empower themselves with their voice. I think sometimes when we look at the, you know, what we call bias is a big thing that we talk about a lot. Inclusive reporting we talk about a lot, implicit bias. These are all topics that we discuss on a daily basis. We have like most newsrooms, we have an editorial meeting at 10:15, and we stand there, and it would surprise a lot of people to stand in that room and to hear the reporters calling each other out on their bias. You wouldn't think that newsrooms would be that vocal with each other, but the reporters are. And so I think one of the things about this particular story was, again, who covers the story, how likely is a source going to be comfortable with them, how much have they built up that source, and whether or not the line, you know, came down because of gender. It also came down on reporting style. Melanie has a light touch. She knows how to approach a source. New reporters, when they come in, new photographers, new reporters, I've done a lot of photography work, I will go out with them and I will watch how they approach a source. I will watch how they approach a story, and I tell them, pretend you're approaching a flock of birds, right? You're not gonna go straight up because the birds are gonna scatter. You're just gonna relax, you're gonna blend in a little bit, and little by little, right, you're gonna approach. And you're gonna make yourself, you know, just like one of the birds. So I think there's also a difference in approach in reporting. It's not just who's reporting, it's how we're reporting and how as a reporter, what is your style? You know, how do you do those small things? How do you reply to a phone call? How do you reply to an email? How ready are you to reply on a text? Do you recognize that if a source is texting you, that's where they're comfortable. You're not going to pick up the phone immediately because you know that that's where you're building your trust with them is through that text. And little by little you can begin to maybe text them, maybe phone call, maybe go meet them for coffee. But I think meeting the source where they are and how they're comfortable and building that I think that is probably the one thing that I recognize in the entire newsroom of reporters rather than at this particular point, like the gender line of how they learn to do their reporting. Couple more things I want to get into before we really open it up to you guys and your questions about all kinds of stuff because I know you have them. I want to talk about this harmony that we try and keep with our personal life, and if you're not laughing right now, you're probably one of those people that's feeling a little buried. It's and I'll, you know, full disclosure, I've been on 14-hour days for probably 2 to 3 weeks now, splitting my days sometimes. I live an hour from the station, so I get in about between 6 and 7. I'll stay. I'm a head coach for a track team. I will leave at 2, go get my track team started, come back, and I'll be working till maybe 7 or 8. So that's not harmony right there. That's nuttiness, right? I walked in today with duct tape on my hem because I didn't have time to hem my skirt. And I couldn't. Staples. Oh, duct tape works much better, trust me, because they don't poke your skin. Actually, gaff tape is the best, but I couldn't find the gaff tape today. And those of you who don't know what gaff tape is, talk to the AV person in the back. And always have a little strip of gaff tape somewhere in your bag, somewhere on you. See? Yeah, we got some gaff tape. Anyway, so my point is, if you're going to be a journalist, writer, anything that you've got to be inside your head, if you've got to dedicate time to yourself and other people, harmony is something you're going to have to wrestle with. And I don't use the term balance because that implies that there could be a moment where you're off balance, and we're always off balance. But the harmony is really how you begin to resolve your personal life with your professional life. So, any great tips about how to keep the harmony with your personal and your professional when you're starting out, when you realize you're on a big story, when you want to impress your editor? What are like a couple of things you would say?
It's really different when you have a big story. You've been living that, and so you have to take advantage of when you don't. I've just always had the philosophy that if you're going to be a journalist, there are times when the journalism just comes first. And there are times when it doesn't. If your kid needs to go to the hospital, it doesn't really matter what the story is at that moment. But generally, I've been fortunate enough that I've not had those two things pressing at the same time. So you just give it all. I've worked long hours. I've been on call at home for the last probably since 1998, and that means a lot of calls at home every night. So I've lived that. But then when you're not doing that, you're just very focused on the other things that you have in your life. And you just have to make that commitment to not be doing it every single day for 15 hours nonstop. That's not sustainable.
And you also need that person to check you, whether it's a colleague, a person that works maybe in another city, anybody that can really check you. And you need somebody that's going to be honest with you. Like, hey, you're in the weeds on this. You kind of need to step out. Or, if you really want to own this story, you got to get back in there. So I think those people that can be very frank with you. And sometimes it's a mentor. Sometimes you can find a mentor that can help you along. And sometimes you end up being the mentor, to somebody. Any tips on finding harmony there?
No, but if you guys know, let me know. One thing I do want to say, and again, it's specific to this reporting, but I've never had this experience before, and it was really instructive to me. This was an all-consuming story to do, and it was, so it was all hours, and you're talking to people, again, about the worst experience of their lives. And what I've found out from my friends who are social workers is there is such a thing called vicarious trauma, and that it can affect you very deeply. And it affected me really deeply. And I wasn't super aware of it because I was kind of on the adrenaline of the story and just focused. And I had a friend come and visit, and we were out to dinner, and she's like, "You don't look good." And it was just kind of, one of those friends that can be like, "You look terrible, you're not taking care of yourself." And I wasn't taking care of myself because I was only thinking about that story. I would love to say that I figured out how to deal with it. What I did was get them all done and then go on vacation for 10 days and not pick up my phone, which was very helpful. But I also think it's really important for us to be honest. I haven't shied away. People in the Capitol kind of knew that I was emotionally affected by this. And at first I was kind of embarrassed by it. And now I'm not, because I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we are human beings in addition to being journalists. And we're talking about very difficult, traumatic things. And by the way, it's an enormous amount of responsibility that we have, because these are stories that make or break people's lives. People resigned because of the stories that we're doing. People are not in office anymore. And these women, and sometimes men, put themselves on the line. It's a tremendous amount of responsibility. It's a lot of pressure. And I think it's important for us to be honest in our reporting process about how that can affect us, how sometimes we need to maybe take a step back. I remember back in January, so when all the lawmakers came back, because the craziest thing about this story, just as a side note, is that this all happened while they were gone. This happened during legislative recess.
Yeah.
So, like, basically an asteroid hit the Capitol, but nobody was there. So they all came back 2 months later to see, like, the smoldering ashes. And one of the lawmakers came up to me and said, hey, how are you doing? And I'm like, okay. And he said, I was listening to your podcast. By the way, brief plug that my boss and I do a podcast on California state politics, California Politics Podcast. Feel free to subscribe. And he's like, and you sounded tired. And I was like, yeah, I was really tired. And again, I like came back and I'm like, oh my God, the people who I cover are like now asking me about my emotional well-being. Like I must not be keeping a really good poker face. But I also don't think I need to keep a real poker face because I actually think that, we are not the story, but we are very involved in the story. And I think it's important to be honest because until I was honest with myself and it was really my friend saying you look terrible, I couldn't realize that like covering the story was actually having this very profound effect on me and therefore I wasn't doing the things to take care of myself because burnout is real. These emotional kind of like burdens that you're carrying are real. And if we want to keep covering the story, because the story is not going to be done in just 2 or 3 months, we need to have the like sustenance to keep going. And that means sometimes like checking in with yourself mentally and being like, how are you doing today? And if it's not great, like maybe tell your boss that you need a breather. And that's hard to do if you're like type A and you don't want to admit weakness, but I think that it's not weakness, it's being honest and it's making sure you can be the best reporter you can be.
That's a good point. And you're leading me to this other part of the discussion. It is about how our stories affect our personal well-being, and they also affect the way we can continue to do our jobs. Because when you do get so far into the weeds and you do begin to take on some of those emotions and you're no longer thinking clearly, especially if you're on a story that's taking you into long hours, you're not doing the best work. Before I came over to journalism, I was in the fire service. I did a lot of critical incident stress debriefing in that capacity, and I realized during the last election cycle that I was having to put some of those skills that I had learned into place again in the newsroom. Reporters were coming in with some of the same things I was seeing back from my fire service days. And so back in August, I went back to training for critical incident stress management, and those are practices that I use in the newsroom, not on a daily basis, but during weeks like this. And you're right, until we acknowledge as an industry that this is something that affects us, we will continue to see good reporters burn out, we will see good stories not be reported fully because we aren't thinking clearly. So it is something that's that I think that, again, the gut check from your friend, the gut check from a mentor, somebody like that, keep those things in the front of your mind, especially when you know you've got a story that's going to keep you, you're going to have to be engaged with for quite a while. Let's see, what else was I going to ask about that harmony with your personal life? You made me laugh when you said about if your kid's in the emergency room. I thought about a story. I was working in San Francisco at the time, and I was on the road to San Francisco. My son had been sick, and he's going to be fine, I'm sure. My husband said, well, I'll take him to the doctor today. And I said, but he's just got the stomach flu or something. Well, I'm halfway to San Francisco, and I get a phone call, you need to come straight to the emergency room. He's having an emergency appendectomy. So immediately was the horrible mom, horrible producer, I'm going to miss everything. But those are the moments where you have to sort of step back and realize that, okay, this is the moment the journalism has to take a back seat. Because, again, like in this week, journalism's taking the front seat. So I think those are moments that I think you're very well to point out that we do have to make those sort of deals with ourselves sometimes. The last thing I want to cover before we really open it up to you guys is how do we cover topics that may not have been at the forefront of our mind, may not have been the topic that was on our beat, may not be something that I really thought about, maybe it's something that I don't quite agree with. How do we approach something when we do have a little bit of a, not necessarily an ethical discussion within ourselves, but just that moment, like how do you talk to a reporter who comes to you and says, this story, I'm gonna do it, but I'm really having a hard time because if it's this story, I'm not sure I believe what's going on, or, I just think, why didn't these women just say, get away from me? How do you talk to a reporter that comes to you with something like that? Besides okay, we need to get you to some inclusive and bias training, but for now, we're gonna talk about this.
Right, it sounds like you're saying they have a bias involved with
yeah.
the story. And I've run into that over the course of my career, and if it is sometimes you take a reporter off because you need the story done.
Yeah.
And you need it done well, and they clearly are not the right person to do it. But generally, where I've run into it most of the time is just somebody they're uncomfortable with it. There's something about the topic, and I did not run into that on this story. Maybe some discomfort with that notion of invading somebody's privacy, and what you were talking about, Melanie, about just being so careful with the responsibility that you have. More often, sometimes somebody just doesn't want to do a story. And, one technique is you have somebody else do it really well, so it gets lots of attention, and then readers get to read it anyway, and the reporter involved learns a lesson. But mostly, I think, as an editor or a manager of any kind, is you just have to pay attention to that. Some people are really uncomfortable with certain topics, and maybe they don't want to cover the prisons because they have a family history connected to something and they just can't deal with it. Or they're afraid to be in a certain neighborhood after dark or something. Anything can come up. These are people in a newsroom. But in the main, most journalists I know do it because they are curious and they're interested and they're always learning and they're brave and courageous and they want to do it. So I don't see this as a pervasive problem, but you have to pay attention.
Right. Yeah. I think that idea of are you the right reporter to do this particular story? And a lot of times when the reporters pitch a story, they will usually say, and I think I can do the story because, and they will kind of walk you down that line. Or a reporter may come and say, I'll do this. I'm not sure that I have the subject matter expertise for this. Am I the right person? So I agree. And what, as a reporter, what if you were given a story, given something, and you're just not quite feeling it? How do you manage that? What's the conversation you have with your editor if you're assigned a story?
Right. Well, I
Or a
think
topic.
so. There's like two different sort of buckets for that, right? If it's I'm not feeling it because I don't know a lot about this and I just don't find it interesting, then I think it's like, okay, you need to do some reporting, because the truth is if we're in this industry, we mostly can we can be coaxed to fall in love with any beat or story. You just kind of have to talk to enough people and know enough. I think a lot of times when you're like, well, that doesn't interest me very much, just because I don't really know a lot about it and I find it kind of intimidating. But I've had a lot of beats sort of dropped in my lap over the year that I thought were not going to be things that I were interested in, that the more I knew, then I would be churning out storyless ideas that were, pages long. And I think sometimes it's just, you need to get in there and start the reporting, and then you're going to eventually fall in love with it too. If it's that you have reservations about it because you aren't sure that it's accurate or you aren't sure that somebody is credible, that's when I think you have to rely on your colleagues. And there's been a lot of times, even in the context of this, these sexual harassment stories, it'll be a one byline story or two people on the byline, but there's a lot more people behind that, all the way up the editorial chain, and even colleagues who aren't working on this, but just people who I trust, who I would say, check me on this. Here's what my instinct tells me. Do you agree? What do you think about this? And I think that there are times where people have said to me, you're being kind of dismissive about this thing, but I actually think it's pretty credible because of X, Y, and Z. And then that's okay, that's actually pretty persuasive. So I think a lot of it is relying on your colleagues in the newsroom to be I know that I'm not the only authority on this. So tell me what I'm missing here. And that's swallowing your pride and admitting that you're not going to be the all-knowing person on this, and that it makes your story better to go to somebody and say this doesn't feel quite right. Am I wrong here? And then sometimes they'll say, yeah, it doesn't feel quite right. And then you're like, yeah, I know, news instincts are awesome. But that's
that means that you have to just be willing to like rope more people into the process, because that will invariably make your story better.
All right, it's your turn. Questions?
I have a legal question
Uh-oh,
for Joe.
okay.
So you've heard about a harassment case, and you know the name of the source, and you have her phone number. And you call her up and you say, I'm Joyce Terhar, I'm a reporter for the Bee. I understand there's a harassment issue involving you. Would you like to talk to me about it? And she says, okay. But what you don't tell her is you're secretly recording her. No, wait a minute. Okay? Now, in California, it's illegal, a civil case, if both people expect a confidential communication, right? Then if one of them breaks that, then that's a lawsuit. Now, you have had 2 reporters at the Bee, and they've run 2 scenarios by me. I won't tell you the names. Okay. One of them said, no, you should never do that. You should ask them if it's okay if I record you. Now, the other lawyer said, if you identify yourself as a reporter from the Bee, they should have no expectation of confidentiality.
So I've had a lawyer, the Bee's lawyer, say to me that that is true legally, that if you are identified as a reporter and you're talking to somebody, that they should have no expectation of confidentiality.
Once you identify yourself.
That's, yeah, once you identify yourself. I would say that's a little bit different than secretly recording somebody, and I also think that beyond the law, you want to be an ethical journalist. That's extremely important to me. So I think as a beginning standpoint, people need to know what you expect from you. You know, the scenario, it's hard for me to react to that scenario because I can't see a reporter approaching it quite in that way anyway, because, you know, we've been talking about how this is a very difficult kind of a story to report because people need to trust you and they're talking about something very personal and private and traumatic. So nobody's gonna call somebody and just say it like that. You might call and say, you know, I'm working on this story, can we meet for coffee? Or your friend so-and-so said you might be open to talking to me. You know, you'd have some kind of way to get in, right? But I just can't imagine calling somebody cold on this kind of a story and secretly doing something like that. You know, so California, it is illegal. You can record yourself, but not them, right? And then where I think that it is becoming increasingly muddy is maybe not so. Maybe this has always been an issue for broadcast. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective. But at least in the print world, as video and audio become more and more a crucial part of the reporting, it is more a matter of, I think, public expectation that if you identify yourself as a journalist, that you might well be recording. But I still think we're in this sort of gray area, you know, given the law, given the ethics involved, where it is a far better approach to be very clear about what you're doing.
You can take notes.
You can take notes. And I would argue if you're in the Capitol talking to a politician, you don't have to say every time, oh, by the way, my iPhone's on record. You know, you've got your iPhone in their face.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, so if you're in person, it's also a pretty apparent thing if you're recording somebody. The issue then comes if you're on the phone and you've got it tapped into your phone and you're not talking to somebody. That would be illegal in this state. You could probably get out of it with a good lawyer, because they would say the expectation. That's what I've had a lawyer say to me, but I don't think it's a good practice.
Okay.
And just to piggyback off of that and more broadly, one of the things, if you're talking with politicians or public figures and they kind of know the drill, then you don't have to be quite so, like you said, you know, I'm recording you now, or is that okay? Or like, you know, I talked to a politician, like it's on the record unless we are otherwise specified. It's a politician. I was surprised and I actually got like kind of my speech down pretty good, that when I was talking to the primarily women for these stories, I basically had a speech of like, okay, here's how this is gonna go. And I walked them through the process. And so again, in terms of like your sources not being surprised, they weren't gonna be surprised basically from the first conversation we had. And it was like, you and I are gonna talk and it's off the record, and this is what off the record means. And then at a certain point, you know, you may decide, and I said, and then I'm gonna text you a lot. And then you might decide that you wanna talk on background and you're gonna give me some sort of tidbits that I can then use for other reporting. And then we're gonna be at that stage. And it was, the reason I did that is because a lot of people, particularly the women that I was talking to, they're not dealing with the media on a regular basis. I was surprised how many people thought by talking to me one time off the record that their story was going to be in the LA Times the next day without them knowing it. And I think that's because of like, you know, newspaper movies and stuff, like breaking news. And then, so I had to walk them through this, and I had to tell them like, you and I are gonna have a lot of conversations, it's gonna get really emotional. I said, and then there's gonna be a point where I'm gonna have to kind of turn on you. It's gonna feel like I'm turning on you, because I'm gonna go from being your confidant to kind of your prosecutor, and I'm going to try and sort of check anything that could be used to undermine what you're saying to me. And I'm going to ask you really uncomfortable questions, and I'm gonna go through your social media. And, you know, I don't think I told them this, but we ran background checks on all of these people. Actually, what we did, because I asked them then about things that came up in their background checks. And I said, and then the story is going to be edited 1,000,000 times, and I'm going to be texting you at all hours with crazy questions that you're like, why is this happening? So then it's going to be run by the lawyer. And the point of me saying this at the beginning of, now granted, if I had gotten the vibe that this would scare them off, I wouldn't give them the whole spiel. But I got pretty good at giving the spiel, and I will tell you that it made my sources much more comfortable with me, because they thought, okay, there's a roadmap here. And at any point, there's going to be an off-ramp, and I can say, like, I'm not comfortable with this. But I didn't want people to, like, get, you know, neck deep in the process and then think, whoa, this is not what I signed up for. And so, to me, that was really important, not just about recording or, like, expectations of privacy, but, like, having definitions and expectations at every step of the way actually made people feel like they were, to your point, empowered to be telling their story.
Could you explain to the students who may not be completely familiar with what off the record and explain to the students what off the record means, what background means, not for attribution, because sometimes it's not well understood even by professionals.
Well, I think every professional kind of has their own definition to it, right? Which is part of the issue. We're not licensed like doctors or lawyers, so there's, you know, like we all have a general understanding, but what I tell sources sort of the first time I work with them in any story is like, hey, all right, here's the parameters, and here's my definitions of what it means to be off the record, on background, or on the record. On the record obviously being the easiest, which everybody knows what that means. It means I can quote them, I can use their full name, any information that they give me, I can attribute to them. In the story, it's fair game. Off the record is also kind of easy for me to describe, which is I'm saying, like, it's in the vault. Like, you're telling me something, and that's good for me to know, but it's not going past here. And I'm not taking the information that you're using, even if it's, you know, like, not attached to your name, and using it to report. So a lot of times I'll have conversations that are off the record, which then I'll say, like, would you feel comfortable with, you know, with that being on background? And on background, I think, is the one that's haziest, and people say things like deep background or like double secret deep background, and like, I don't mess with any of that. Background to me is something that I negotiate with the source, but it typically means that while their name is not attached to it, the information that they give me, I can use for further reporting. And that means that if they've said, like, you know, I've heard that so-and-so has firsthand knowledge of this, I can call so-and-so, and I won't say, hey, person X told me to call you, but I can call that person because that information was on background. If I'm gonna quote them, then we negotiate what the attribution is. It won't be their name, but it would be legislative staffer or a source familiar with the conversations or all of that. But that's a conversation I have with news sources all the time, because everybody has like slightly different operating procedures to that. And like, I know they're working journalists in the audience, like they might have heard my definition of background and been like, that is nonsense, and like, that's great. I'd love for improvements, but that's the one that is the pact that I have with my source, so that then, again, going back to like, they're not gonna be surprised. They're not gonna be surprised if that tidbit they told me on background shows up in my story without their name attached to it, because they told it to me on background.
And when we're talking about the different platforms, so if we're talking about broadcast or radio specifically, nothing is recorded until they're on the record.
I had a question. Sorry, my name's Robin. By the way, I'm a journalist. Hi. I have also been in the position where you almost play therapist to your source. They tell you deep things that they then feel like they have a personal relationship with you, and they want to continue that relationship after the story is over, which gets into a whole different realm. But I'm curious to know it's not cultivation of the source, but obviously these are people who work in the Capitol, and so Melanie specifically, I guess, how do you continue to talk to these people once you've used them for a big story like this? Do they stay a part of your source wheel and people that you continue to talk to for other things as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you've done your job right, those relationships should continue. For these particular stories, the vast majority of the women that I talk to actually aren't working in the Capitol anymore. And a lot of them aren't in Sacramento. A lot of these women who were so crucial to me doing my story, I've never met them. It was all entirely like by phone or text message, a lot of hours on the phone, but like I've never met them face to face. But yeah, I mean, I think that there are, for the people, and by the way, I do still keep in touch with them, not regularly, but I'll send text messages to them every once in a while, just saying like, hey, how are things going? I mean, again, I feel a lot of responsibility for them because they're like, their name comes up in a Google search now. Like this story is part of them for the rest of their lives. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm friends with them, but I think it's also, I'm not a robot in that I'm not going like to disassociate with them. And I think for the people who, are with the Capitol, like working the Capitol, and there have been very sort of intense personal conversations, I think people are like remarkably good at sort of like compartmentalizing and also realizing like, okay, now we're going to be talking about a bill, which is like a very different conversation. But I mean, absolutely, for those people who I've had those conversations with, it's, I think that level of connection sort of, maintains. And, I'm not entirely sure, I'm not entirely sure that every person who I've wrote about was like thrilled with the story that came out, which again, I can't promise that they're gonna like it, I can just promise they won't be surprised. But I think that a good indication of how they felt during the reporting process is that they chose to continue talking to me afterwards, and I think that is less about the actual story, but more about how I conducted myself during the reporting of that story that kept those relationships alive.
And I would say that goes back to the credibility you have, and you've got to hang on to that for, however many years you've been covering the Capitol, right? If your credibility had been questioned 2 years ago, and then you would have tried to do this type of story, things would have been different at the end, probably. But I think that's why it's really key as a reporter to start out with your credibility intact and just continue that along the way. And it's sometimes it gets to be a bit difficult, but I think Melanie's outlined some really some good language to use, and just the knowledge that this is your job. And if you know that this is your job and the person on the other side of the desk, that's their job, I think that goes a long way in building confidence, building other people's confidence in you. That you are aware of your job, you're aware of what you are setting out to do, and you're making it very apparent about what you're doing. Transparency is a big word we're trying to use more often, and be beholden to that word.
Hi, Melanie, you talked a minute ago about background checks for your sources, and it kind of reminds us we still have to be very skeptical in our roles as journalists and as editors, and I'm kind of curious, what a background check in this context entails with these sources, and for each of you and your institutions, how often, if at all, have you used them?
I mean, yeah, I don't want to make it sound like we have like a PI investigating these folks or anything, but it's basic public record searches, court records. I definitely look at everybody's social media. If it turns out that this person has been like posting terrible things about this person for a while and it feels more like a vendetta than something else, like that will be something, it's not disqualifying, but it's then something that I ask them about and hopefully get them to preemptively sort of answer in the story. And that was something that, you know, again, I had those conversations a lot with the sources of like, what, if someone was trying to undermine your credibility, what will they point to? And I remember there was this one woman who said, well, you know, this was somebody who worked for Boca Negra, and she said that he was basically asking her out every week for like a year and a half when she was a very, very young office worker, and he was the chief of staff, and that made her really uncomfortable because she couldn't really say no, but she also didn't want to go out on dates with him. And so she said, you know, I did send him an email after an election, like 2 years later, where I just said like, hey, I'm like thinking of, you know, like he had lost, it was a long backstory, but basically like a friendly sounding email that if somebody surfaced up, they would have said like, she couldn't have been telling the truth about what she's saying now because look at this email that sounds friendly. But the explanation she gave me was, you know, I was kind of trying to feel out if they, you know, like what, she had left the office on non-good terms. She was trying to feel out how things were between her and this very powerful political crew. And we basically quoted her in the story saying, this is the reason why I sent this email. Now, they didn't even bother to trot that email out in trying to disparage her. They didn't end up participating in the story at all. But we preemptively sort of had it in there, partially to communicate to our readers, like, look, we scrubbed her. And if there were things that we thought maybe weren't aligning with her story, we're going to put that in our story too, and you can be the judge if we think her explanation is credible or not. And again, to your transparency point, I think it is showing the reader our work, that like we know the gravity of these accusations, and here are all the ways that we've tried to sort of account for that on the front end. And yeah, I mean, just in terms of like how much pressure there is, I mean, there was the Roy Moore story that came out while I was reporting one of these stories. And then there was, if you all remember, a couple of weeks later, a story that also came out about the Washington Post, from the Washington Post, that Project Veritas, which is a right-wing group, tried to plant a fake story about Roy Moore. And that basically was going to use that as a way to discredit the media by saying, look, they ran this fake allegation. Because the Washington Post is very good, they figured this out, and ended up writing a story about this false accusation and will look to be this kind of campaign to undermine them. But man, that scared the hell out of me when that story ran. And it just goes to show that
everybody.
Yeah, like believing women is important, but our job is not to be cheerleaders. Our job is to be accurate and kind of unflinching in our quest for accuracy.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, beyond the Me Too reporting, it just something that you all need to just kind of hold near and dear. You need to try to disprove a story as much as you work to prove it. And over the years, you know, with various investigations I've been involved with, you know, you as an editor, you are always feeling far better about the reporting when you can see that a reporter has done that, and if they haven't, then you have them do it at that point. It is very dangerous to go in with a preconceived idea about something. Like in this case, it could be that the women are automatically right? I mean, it could be any story. And you can make a lot of things look like something is true if you don't do the work to see if it isn't true. And it's just something that should be kind of second nature for everybody.
And that is the role of your editor. So when you go along your career and you get that editor going toe to toe with you saying, I'm finding a huge hole right here. I could drive a truck through this hole. Be mindful that the editor is just trying to help you make your story stronger. We have a lot of discussions like this early in the morning where the editors are arguing with each other over a particular phrase. And sometimes it's those phrases, to be honest, that will catch an editor's eye, and then the editor will go back and say, okay, wait a minute, now I'm questioning a couple of things up higher here, and you know, this phrase is kind of turning me in a different direction. Are you sure that we have these particular things, you know, buttoned down? So again, those really tough conversations that you're having with your editors, your colleagues, having them gut check you, those are all ways to make your reporting stronger, but also ways to help you, you know, with your own BS detector, is what I like to call it. So, yeah. Other question?
Yeah, I have two questions. More talking about piggybacking on your harmonizing aspect that you talked on, were there any instances within this actual story where you thought that you were like too over your head, and if there were, how did you cope with them?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that I didn't feel like I was in over my head, because I felt like I had a good sort of conviction about what I had to do, and had the resources of a newsroom and really experienced people to help guide me. But I mean, there were definitely times where I was like, I don't know if I'm handling the stress super well. And I remember at one point telling my editor, like, this is a lot for me. In fact, it was like a lot more panicky and like a lot of swear words. And like that was, and then the next day I woke up and I was totally embarrassed, and I thought that they would never take me seriously again, because I had shown this like weakness of like kind of being intimidated by this pressure, and it is a ton of pressure. And I remember I like sent her this like very sheepish note being like, hey, sorry for freaking out yesterday. And she said, of course you're freaking out. Like, we're all, this is the type of story that you're going to have a freak out over. But also, like, do you need to just like take a day and like, get a massage or something like that? And I didn't, because I wanted to keep working on it. So I think in terms of like having that sort of North Star about what I wanted to do journalistically, I felt like I had a good foundation for that, and that wasn't anything that I questioned. But just in terms of like stress management, I'm a political reporter, which is like, I really admire investigative reporters. I've done some short-term investigations. I've never done investigations that would, ruin people's lives before. It's a lot of pressure. And so I think there were moments where I just kind of the gravity would hit me all at once. But I'm okay, I'm here.
And the second question I had was a more generalized question. Because you are all really accomplished women, I wanted to know if we can get some tips on how to get started in our careers, like internship-wise, where to look, what things to do, sort of tips like that.
Where do we start? So I think just being here and asking questions, that's the first step, right? Being aware that there are goals that you want to set for yourself, that's another step. I think there's also this self-awareness. What are the things that I'm really good at? And what are the things that I'm going to need a partner to help me with, or a support system? I think those are, when you begin to take stock of where your strengths are and where you're going to need support, I think that's the one thing that I've realized along the way, that I know I can do that. I know I can do that really well. I know in order to get to that next step, I'm going to be a little challenged, but I'm also going to take that step. I think that self-awareness sometimes is the key to getting started. There are all kinds of little, small bits along the way. Find a good mentor. Find somebody that you admire, that you see as the person you'd like to, help you along. But I think the self-awareness for me has become, over time, like I said, I jumped from one very distinct career to another. I think that self-awareness became very apparent. Like, I know I'm a good documentary filmmaker. I know I can sit across from somebody and I can get them to talk to me. I don't know that I could do what Melanie does day to day. I would lose my marbles, right? But I know in a newsroom, I can organize the chaos, and I can make sure the operation runs smoothly. I can make sure I'm, covering everything that needs to be covered editorial. I know my organizational skills, but I know that would make me nuts. So I'm gonna hire somebody that's amazing to do that. I'm gonna hire an amazing editor to do what the editor does, and I'm gonna stay in my lane and get out of their way. So self-awareness is one thing.
I'd just add, you're at a point in your life where you have to take the steps. And one advantage that you all have is, in today's world, you don't have to wait for, a giant newspaper or online site or television station to hire you to produce work. There's just so much you can do on your own now. And that is perhaps the first step, but I would get, Sac State has a good newspaper. You've got, all kinds of opportunities that are more broadcast oriented. I would start there. I would be aggressive about internships. You know, don't just set your heart on one and apply to one, apply to 20 or something, you know? I mean, just use the relationships of your instructors here and reach out even beyond the department for that. I've seen some just really aggressive young go-getters get involved in industry groups at a much younger age than I ever did, for instance, and SPJ would be one example of that, right? So you all are here tonight, but there are all kinds of other opportunities, and there are things like, you know, the Online News Association, which has a giant annual conference, and I would just kind of like look at the breadth of potential and start building a path toward it. But it fundamentally starts with the work. You know, you have to figure out, as Linnea said, what are you good at? And then get good examples of that work. Because if you're good, you'll find something. You know, you just have to have the work to show what you can do.
The one last thing I'd add is, you know, don't balk at opportunities. We in Sacramento right now are in the middle of a national news story for very sad reasons, but there are a lot of places outside of Sacramento that are desperate to know what's going on here, and you guys have the finger on the pulse. You know the community. You might have, you know, like here at Sac State, there might be conversations going on that can offer a new perspective. So would I say email the national editor of the New York Times and say, hey, I'll be a stringer for you? Probably that might be a little high if you're starting out, but I would say that if there is, you know, outlets that are, you notice that outlets are writing about things that are going on in your backyard, there's no harm in volunteering yourself and saying, I am a resource for you. Especially in all these newsrooms now, everyone does not have the resources that they used to. Editors are trying to figure out kind of how to cover this sort of insatiable desire for news with fewer people than they had before. And so whether it is the conversation that's going on now about sort of police community relations, if you think that you have something to add, or something else is going on, we're in the middle of a campaign season in California, actually is really important to the national conversation. You know, make a list of where you think outlets are that you could say, hi, I just want you to know, like, I am here in this community, I am well sourced, and I'm available if you need me to drive out to Modesto to see Jeff Denham speak or something like that. There's no harm in making, you know, in putting yourself out there. A lot of times they're going to not get your emails returned, so a lot of it is, as Joyce said, applying to 20 internships instead of one. But knowing that there's opportunities there and capturing them at the moment is crucial.
You just gave me acid reflux with the whole election thing again, yeah. And we do, at Capital Public Radio, we do end up bringing in reporters and producers for election. And this week, we've had everybody working, you know, as often as they can. I've been approached by students from other universities, and you know, they're ready to go. So if you do that, I recommend you do that. Then I also recommend you show up. And when I say show up, it means you're ready to work. You're ready to work. You're ready to work the hours that we're asking of you. You're going to deliver on deadline. You're going to do superb work. When you come in, and I'm sure this is for other newsrooms, when you come into the newsroom, I don't look at you as a student. I look at you as a journalist. We're going to mentor you. We're going to show you the ropes. We're going to bring you along. But I expect the same ethics and the same work standards that we would expect out of our reporters, because that's why you're there. You know, we're there to help you train, and we want you to deliver the best work that you can deliver.
Hi, my name's Kelly, and I'm a reporter.
Kelly, where are you? Wave. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Can you guys elaborate a little bit more on not forcing a source to share their story, and can you give me some tips on how to make them feel comfortable in doing so? And when do you guys know? When and how do you know when it's time to kill a story?
Interesting.
Or when you hold the story like a baby, and you carry it around and you feed it and hope it grows. You know, about the sourcing, Melanie's, I'll let her speak to this because it's some of the things that she's been doing recently. A lot of times the reporters will come in and they'll say, I'm having a really hard time with this. A lot of times it's approach, and it's also giving, for me in my role, and I'll let Melanie speak to her role, but for me in my role, it's helping the reporter understand or find different ways to approach the source? And is this the best way? Or tell me a little bit about how you were talking to them. How are they communicating? Where was the stop? I'll ask them, where were they putting up the stop signs for you? And how long have you known this person? And did you just go to this person for this story, or is this a long relationship that you've had? So my role is to really sort of pick through some of those things to find out what are the barriers, and let's remove barriers. Mel has a different sort of perspective. I mean, she's doing some of the same things, but she's on the ground with them one-to-one.
Yeah, and I'll say it's trial and error, and there's really, it's an art, not a science for sure. And in fact, a good example of that is how I almost lost a story because I was being so light touch on it. When I had gotten sort of the advance peek at this letter that these women had signed, right before the story posted, I got a text message from a source, one of the people who had signed the letter, who I had known previously, and she said, I'm really glad that you're the one doing the story. I just wanted to say thank you. I heard that you're writing this. And said something about like the person who had assaulted me. I had been approached by a reporter several years ago, and I just wasn't ready to talk about it. And I had spent the whole day talking to these women who were saying, like, we're not naming names, don't make this about the names, I thought I was being super respectful. But then I did not follow up with, who's the person that assaulted you? I just said, I wrote back and said, I can't imagine what this is like to have this kind of all dredged up again, but, we just kind of like just normal, nice person things. And then we kept texting and staying in touch. And then she told me, she ended up deciding I'm ready to go forward and to name the person who assaulted me. And again, this would have been the first person to actually attach a name. And she said, when I had mentioned it to you before, you didn't ask me who it was, and so I thought that meant you weren't interested. And I'm like, oh my God, of course I was interested. I was trying to be super respectful and not push you beyond those boundaries. So that was, for me, a lesson of like, there is a way where you can overcorrect on this. And so now a lot of this is more like, do you feel comfortable like talking to me about who this person is? And if they say no, I say, okay, well, let's just talk about the situation first and kind of in gradations. A lot of this is, do you feel comfortable about doing this? Do you feel comfortable about doing that? But there are definitely times where I think I weighed more the side of what people's comforts were than like the aggressiveness of getting the story. And there's no perfect calibration of that. I can look back and think like, okay, I maybe could have pushed this person a little bit harder. That's just sort of, again, you get a feel for it. I got a lot better at that the more reporting I was doing, even within these last couple of months. But that was a really interesting, like, first experience where I thought I was being super, super respectful, and in fact, she was waiting to tell more. And like that miscommunication told me a lot.
So I'd like to address the when to kill a story piece of it. And differentiate that from, it's one thing if a reporter goes out and works on a story and just finds out there's no story, it's not true or whatever, and comes back and tells the editor why and whatnot. It is an entirely different thing if you have a story that just isn't ready to be published either today or ever. And I would say it's far more common to just go back and try and make it publishable. So with this kind of a story, as Melanie was saying, a lot of the reporting starts way off the record. And it is a matter of just these constant conversations to get to a place where people either get comfortable enough and they go on the record in the way that you need, or you get enough information around that person to be able to get what you need, and you eventually decide that something is ready to go, right? You've vetted, done all the backgrounds, vetted everything, talked to the lawyer, it's ready. In my experience, it was pretty rare to kill something. A big red flag for me is if a reporter can't tell me what they have and why they think they have it. Even after doing all the reporting and writing a big, long thing, I need the reporter to be very confident about the information they have and to be able to answer every single question I have. And generally, you know, you'll find if you're working on something that is an investigation or it is a very sensitive story, you're going to get asked a lot of questions. And you were talking about how you warn your sources that you will become a prosecutor at some point. That is how your editor might sound, and it is, think of it as them just completely protecting you and whatever company you're working for. It isn't about a lack of confidence. It is about a very detailed assessment of what you have and whether, you know, the thing about at the level I was working at, where you're not enmeshed every single day in every conversation with the reporter where they come running in to tell their editor what they just got out of an interview, if you're a little bit more removed, you see holes that you don't normally see if you're the reporter or the immediate editor. Just because something doesn't make sense, or you see a couple of things that contradict each other, or a pretty significant question that's not answered. So that's just part of the process. But if you as the reporter are confused about what you have, you need to figure it out and use your editor to help you do that. And you need to be able to answer every single question. I would say if you take on something that is this heavy a topic, you need to be incredibly detail oriented and organized in how you do your work. You know, you're asking questions, you're being specific sometimes about dates, even times on dates, you know, all the different names, all the, you know, just every single, try and think of a situation in 3D or something, you know, and just every single question that might surround an issue, and then be organized in how you keep those notes. I had the good fortune to work with Charlie Pillar, who was an investigative reporter for the Bee for some time, and did these very complex stories about safety and construction problems with the new Bay Bridge, just all kinds of details. And he was the kind of reporter who had a spreadsheet for just about every single fact. And you'd go through and fact check his story, and you'd ask a question about one sentence, and then he'd just kind of flip a couple of screens over, and he would have all this information about where he got it, what it was, you know, all the different sources verifying it, and there aren't very many reporters who are like that. But as an editor, I will just tell you that that's a really valuable skill.
One thing I tell the reporters too is, I like what you said about when you step away, you begin to see some holes. And I usually tell them, I'm not in your brain, so can you walk me through this part of the story, because I think there's assumptions here that you've made that I don't know. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I'm not a reporter or even a journalism student, but I am a survivor. And I have a question, because there's a lot of problems now with not only this Me Too culture, but, you know, the more recent issues with the mental illness being really prominent. I reported, naturally, but there was question about my, I can't think of the word, my credibility, I'm sorry, because I was exclusive with the officer and the reporter, the person who did the kit and everything, about this. And so my question is a mental illness something you would then take back and say, you know what, I don't know with this mental illness if I can really prove her credibility, or is it something you need to work into the story somehow, or how would you approach that with a survivor?
It's a really good question, and it's something that we wrestle with, because I think that it's unfair to expect of people who have been through these circumstances that they, just like any of us, are completely like unblemished in whatever their personal lives are. Nobody is. And so like that is something that we have to be okay with, these complications, that people might have mental illness, they may have a history of, you know, substance abuse, there may be convictions, like I mentioned, criminal background checks and things like that. I don't think that anything is automatically disqualifying for people telling their stories, but it is something that that we would have to talk about. And that was a conversation I had with several of my sources when we talked about things about criminal records, people's mental health. And we talked a lot about sort of how to address that in the story. And then had those conversations with my sources and also with my editors and with our lawyer. Our lawyer was big in this too. I think that the most important thing is, again, transparency with the reader, so that we make it clear that we know that the backgrounds of everyone who is involved in this story. I don't think that mental illness is disqualifying for people to come out and tell their stories, but I think that is, just as there are other things too, that you just have to sort of address head on, because the worst case is for somebody to report a story and then come back and say, well, you didn't acknowledge that that this person had a conviction for shoplifting or something, which maybe would show some sort of dishonesty or something like that. I'm kind of riffing, but and therefore that undermines your reporting. Whereas if you sort of include that or do that reporting in the front end and tackle these hard things on the front end, we are again then communicating to our readers, we've done all of this work and we have taken into account that there are lots of complicating factors to all of these stories, and if we decide that the story is still, we find to be credible because of the source and then the other corroborating information, and that's the thing that I really need to emphasize, is that we're never just using one source. There's corroboration that goes with medical records, with that they have given us. Obviously, there's privacy around medical records. People who were told contemporaneously, emails, text messages, all of this stuff. And if we have done the work and we think that body of evidence shows that there is a credible story here, we're going to do it. But we're also going to make sure that we're painting the fullest picture possible. And I think that means we all can handle some nuance. I think we need to trust our readers to also understand that situations are complicated and people are complicated, and we don't need everything to be black and white in terms of who is telling their story. But I think that acknowledging on the front end saves you a lot of heartburn later on.
Trusting our reader to pick up on the nuance and then the transparency. I think those are the two key things, and that goes with any reporting that we do, any person that we use at the center of our story. I mean, that's audio, radio is this first person, sound rich narrative in the person's voice. This is something we talk about every day, and we've done a series on mental illness. We've done a series on housing and people who are getting evicted and who are in very difficult situations. But we're all human. We've all been through situations, so there is no, there's not a list of disqualifiers. But I think you're right. We hit it head on, and we're very transparent about our process. I think we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. Anybody?
Can I ask another one? Asking you, Melanie. So you were working a long time on this great story, and it's a one-day story. It has no impact. Is that enough for you?
I mean, it's a good question. It's also a hypothetical that kind of wasn't the case for the reporting that turned out. These things had a tremendous amount of impact. But the truth is we're not reporting seeking an outcome.
Okay.
The reporting is just to tell the story, and to tell it in the most accurate way possible. And so I do think that it is, if you're going into this thinking, I'm gonna take somebody down, you're doing it wrong. And I think that is what sort of skews you. I think that the most important feedback that I'm getting when the story runs are the people who are involved in the story. And that means both the people who are sharing their, sharing what happened to them, and also the people who are getting called out for this behavior. I can't say that I've gotten love letters from the folks who I have written about, but I will tell you that people close to those people have said, your reporting was solid, and that is the kind of feedback that I need. Or that is very gratifying to me, I guess. So I think that we're not setting out for any of these stories with any kind of hopes that this then catches fire and becomes a national news story. Because if you're doing that, then that's going to blind you to the holes in your story, and it's going to prejudice you to how it turns out. You have to be okay with it kind of disappearing into the void as long as you got it right. For me, that's kind of all that matters.
We sometimes say, well, it was a shout into the wind, but it was a good shout. So
One more question? One more? You have one last one? Okay. I think we're up here. Gonna finish us off? Right behind you. Right here. There we go. Yeah, bingo.
Obviously, hindsight is 20/20, but with that in mind, is there anything in having covered this that you would have done differently looking back? And the answer can be no.
There's always, every story we look back on, we could have done this, we could have done that. In particular for this story, it's if you have some really dogged reporters, if you have people in the community, if you have interns, you have people who have, like Mel, who've known that there's been this undercurrent for a long time. Once this thing bubbles up, sometimes it's very difficult to get people's attention off of it when they need to. We continue to get tips. We continue to get people who want to talk to us about the story. They don't want to go on the record, or it's people in the community telling us something that they've experienced. So it's not that there's something we would have specifically done differently looking back, but it's how do we manage a story like that? How, and looking back on it, how do we manage how we're going to tackle different angles of that story? And how do we manage what it's going to take for us to print that story? And there's also something that happens in different newsrooms, and in our newsroom in particular, it's, what do you want to own? Well, people say, well, I want to own this story, I want to own this. Okay, well, that's great, but what are you going to let go of so that you can own this? The let go of, that's the more difficult question. And so a lot of times looking back on stories, it's like, okay, well, if you want to own this particular angle, if you want to own this story, if you want to own this beat, what are you willing to let go of next time? And looking forward, what are you willing to let go of in pursuit of this thing you want to own? So that's one of the ways I look back on things.
I think if I and we kind of as the LA Times, I don't want to speak for them, but like wanting to emphasize how much this was sort of a team effort. But I think one thing that I would have liked to have done, and we had no idea the tidal wave that was crashing down on us. We really didn't. But it would have been great to kind of have a team huddle before all of this stuff got going about where are we and what are our goals in this coverage. A lot of times it felt like we were just trying to keep our head above water. Each one of these stories, I kept thinking like, all right, I know this process now, and then there would be some other crazy thing that would happen. And I think that that's just, these stories are just beasts to do, and there's no way to avoid that. But I think that because of not just what was going on in Sacramento, but what was going on nationally, there was this energy around this and this kind of freneticness. And I think that we would have been well served, and our readers would have been well served if we took a step back at the beginning to say like, all right, this is about to get real. What are our goals here? I think in terms of the work that we turned out, I'm incredibly proud of it, and I don't think that I would have done anything differently there. But I think that in terms of like having that sense of purpose, as opposed to going from like one crazy story to another, the kind of overarching thing, it never hurts to kind of take a step back to sort of get all the heads in the room real quick to say like, okay, we're about to be like riding the tiger. Are we all on the same page about what that's going to look like? The thing I kept saying over and over again in the bureau, to the point where people would roll their eyes, is the Harvey Weinstein story took 8 months to do. It took 8 months to get that story done. And we didn't have 8 months. And we shouldn't have had 8 months because it was a moment, we had to capture that moment. But because of that, we didn't have the luxury of having some of these, I think, kind of higher macro conversations that I like, because I like thinking about sort of the higher level about journalism. So if I could do it again, I would take a minute to breathe and to like think of what the higher purpose is, and then dive right into the craziness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to second that mostly. It was a really competitive story, and Melanie is a fierce competitor. So the notion of, I think if any of us had known getting into it how big it was going to be, and getting a team on it sooner would have been great. The Bee ended up moving Margie Lundstrom, very, very fine investigative reporter into the Bureau to work on this, and then she took on this whole angle that others weren't doing, which is what's going on in the bureaucracy, all the departments, all the universities, and it was quite a bit of document work, but did very good work with that. We could have done that faster. You know, in the end, we always second guess ourselves. We always say this could be better, this could be better. But what happened is significant. You know, 3 sitting legislators are gone. The legislature released all these documents about, you know, sexual harassment complaints and settlements that they had never, they just kept refusing to do it. They promise, you know, on their best behavior that they're going to be more transparent. And there's a bill that might reform Laura a little bit, which is the legislative version of the state PRA. They have exemptions that other agencies don't have. And so probably my only true regret is that we didn't pound on that piece more. Just the need for more transparency at the legislature, this ongoing ridiculous situation where they have the ability to hide correspondence and other kinds of things that, you know, Sac State can't, you know, any other agency can't. So that would have been good. But the outcome is what you would want, you know, in terms of media keeping a really good watchdog eye on people in power. A lot happened because of the reporting.
Well, I'm going to end on that because that was good. See, you got a good editor right there. Thank you, everybody. I think somebody probably has our contact info if you want to contact us. I'm looking around. I see a couple of Cap Radio former interns in here. So if you guys are interested in internships, I'm sure they will make themselves known. Okay, thank you.